Hi, my name is Kyle Bocinsky, and I'm the Director of Climate Extension for the Montana Climate Office. Thanks for joining today. I'm here to present work on agricultural risk in our changing world and give you some outlooks into climate going into the future. The Montana Climate Office is part of the University of Montana, and we serve as Montana's official climate data stewards. Our mission is to provide high-quality, timely, relevant, and scientifically based climate information and services for all Montanans and for producers across the West. We also operate the Montana Mesonet, which is a large and growing network of weather, soil moisture, and snowpack monitoring stations across Montana. So I want to start this session with just a question for you. Think back on the last couple of years. Has your home community, your state, your town, your reservation, etc., broken a weather record in the past few years? Think for a minute. I bet most of you are shaking your head yes, and that would make sense. Because actually, in just the last 30 days, these data are from today, from May 8th. In just the last 30 days, weather stations in the contiguous U.S. have broken many records. We've experienced 1,073 highest high temperature records, daily temperature records, across the contiguous United States in just the last 30 days. We've experienced 411 of the lowest low temperature records, daily records, over that same period of time. So we've seen the highest highs and the lowest lows in just this 30-day period. We've broken 1,793 greatest daily precipitation records across the contiguous U.S. in just the last 30 days. And in the midst of all of this, and keep in mind, it's early May, we've had 73 greatest snowfall records in the contiguous U.S. over the last 30 days. So the question I have for you to frame the rest of our conversation today is this normal? Is this type of record-breaking activity something we should expect? Let me put it a little more succinctly. I've been thinking about this for a while in the Montana Climate Office. Last summer, Montana, and specifically Missoula, Montana, where we are, experienced a string of really hot days in the middle of summer. July 15th to August 15th of last year, we had our highest 30-day period, summer period, on record. Our average high temperature was 94.4 degrees Fahrenheit. If we look back at temperature records for that same period of time, July 15th to August 15th, over the last 50 years, what we see is a long history of varying summer temperatures. If we take that whole period of time and we look at how likely it would be to hit 94.4 degrees Fahrenheit, what we find is that we had about a 1.6% chance if we take that full 70-year period, right? And that's what this bar-shaped curve over here on the right is showing us. It's showing us the distribution of these events. Now let's say we lowered that threshold a little bit, down to 93 degrees, just merely hot, over that same 30-day period. Well, then we see that in the past, there's been 5 years where we hit that 93-degree average high temperature threshold. 1971, 1994, 2003, 2007, and 2022. And we see that if by lowering that threshold, we now have a 3.8% chance of hitting that merely hot date if we're using all of the data over the last 70 plus years. But what if we only use the data over the last 30 years? Well, that's what this is showing you now. Here we've adjusted and we're only using the data from the early 90s through the end of last year. And what we see is that our likelihood of hitting those merely hot days, 93 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, jumps up to almost 10%. So we have a 1 in 10 chance of hitting one of those really hot periods if we're just considering normal as being the last 30 days. And if we consider just those record high days, that likelihood of hitting 94.4 degrees Fahrenheit, we find that we had a 1 in 20 chance, a 4.9% chance of hitting that record high temperature when we consider the last 30 years of data. Here we see that moving window going through time, what the likelihood would be of hitting that 94.4 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. And we see that that likelihood is going up, and our odds are going up as well. We started off at about a 1 in 200 chance of hitting a 94.4 degree average high temperature July 15th to August 15th, and we end up with a 1 in 20 chance or lower. This is the cognitive dissonance of climate change, and it's something that we're all having to grapple with right now. It's this, that an event can simultaneously be record-breaking. We can have record-breaking temperatures, record-breaking smoke, record-breaking snowfall or freezes, and have those events be increasingly common. And that's really the crux of climate change. Under a stationary climate, under no climate change, you wouldn't expect that type of trend. But under climate change, it's what we're coming to expect, breaking records over and over and over again. So in the rest of this talk, I want to give you some tools to start thinking about how we can manage risk in the context of a changing climate. First, I want to talk about drought risk in a changing climate, how that's changing given the current generation of climate projections, and some ideas about what we can do on the policy side and what we can do as producers in order to buffer some of that risk. And then I want to talk about enhancing agricultural resilience. What are the hazards that we see increasing across the United States when it comes to our agricultural production, and how can we start educating ourselves to buffer some of those risks? And we'll start with the U.S. Drought Monitor. The Drought Monitor has been around since January of the year 2000 and has become the de facto assessment tool for drought in the United States. Here we see the history of the Drought Monitor over the last 24 years as we've been in a state of perpetual drought. We've never been outside of drought or abnormally dry conditions at some place in the contiguous United States. We see from the beginning of the Drought Monitor the explosion of aridity in the West, where we've seen, especially in the Southwest, a mega drought. We see the emergence of drought often in the southern plains, and then it tends to have this pattern where it drifts to the north, hitting the west coast, and then exiting the country often out the Pacific Northwest and high plains. You can see drought conditions that we just went through, that long period of drought, the 5-year drought that we had in California. And then we're moving into the COVID years right now, where we saw drought conditions really amplify impacts of a lot of the agricultural impacts of COVID. Let's take a closer look and actually zoom in on all of these large hydrologic basins that we have across the contiguous U.S. And what we see is this picture of our current drought situation. This is since January of 2020, going out to recently, and we see the large droughts that we had during the COVID years, especially in the West, from 2020 through 2023. And then we see the emergence of some more aridity, especially across the southern plains, and a pulse of drought that we had in the south. If we look back to 2000, we can start seeing some macro-scalar trends of drought. You heard me mention, and especially look at these upper ones here, how drought tends to progress from the south to the north, starting in the southern plains, moving into the Colorado Basin and California Great Basin regions, and then exiting out the Pacific Northwest. We see this pattern repeat itself, and it's actually related to the El Nino La Nina cycle that El Nino southern oscillation, that as we move from El Nino conditions into La Nina conditions, we see a progression of drought throughout the contiguous U.S. This is the current status of the drought monitor. It'll update tomorrow, so many of you will probably see some more updated data from this. But what we see right now is some really exceptional drought in the southern plains in southwest or southeastern New Mexico, and then down into Texas. We see abnormal and extreme and severe drought up through the Great Plains, and in some areas of extreme drought in the high plains and in the Rocky Mountains, the northern Rockies, up here where I am, especially along the crown of the continent up near Glacier National Park, where we saw exceptionally low snowpack this year. Colleagues and I have been exploring how we assess drought, both in the context of the U.S. Drought Monitor and just generally, what do we consider drought? And it really comes down to this. Under stationary assumptions, so stationary, by that we mean not changing, no climate change. If there were no climate change, then drought severity would be sort of consistent through time. The same amount of aridity would mean the same amount of drought. But when we are in a changing climate, when portions of the nation are getting drier, drought severity is often exaggerated. It's exaggerated in those locations that are getting drier, that are experiencing aridification, such that our normal, our baseline, is actually shifting. Just like we saw before with high temperatures in Missoula, we're seeing drought, the baseline shifting, and we're seeing us hitting drier and drier and drier conditions, especially in the southwestern U.S. and other areas of the country that are aridifying. So we promoted in this paper to shift to 30-year drought climatologies, just like the climatologies that I was showing you with temperature in Missoula, where our picture of drought, our definition of drought as abnormal aridity, follows that aridification, follows that climate change. We showed in this paper that what we call a period of record bias, that using long climatologies, using all that data from potentially wetter periods, can lead to these big differences in drought. And we showed that this can have big impacts for tools like the U.S. Drought Monitor that base themselves on drought indices, on metrics of aridity on the landscape. What we showed in this figure is that often we can have drought metrics that exceed one class of drought classification difference, either drier or in some cases wetter, based on the directionality of that climate change. Is it getting drier or is it getting wetter in a region? For example, in the southwestern U.S., we're seeing rapid aridification. It's getting a lot drier, and so our droughts are getting drier. And so what we tend to do is exaggerate drought, in a sense, in these regions. Our baseline is shifting, and we're saying, oh my gosh, it's getting drier and drier and drier, which it is. But in reference to that baseline, it's staying relatively consistent. Across the Northwest and the upper Midwest, we're actually seeing the opposite pattern. These areas are getting wetter with climate change, and they've gotten wetter over the last 20 years. And there, we're seeing a bias in the other direction. We're seeing a bias against declaring drought. Farmers in these regions may not be eligible for as much assistance when it comes to drought. So what we are arguing with this work that we did was that the U.S. Drought Monitor, its declarations for severe drought, align with those long, what we call period of record climatologies, and that there's a demonstrable bias against declaring drought in places that are getting wetter, and we're declaring drought in places that are getting drier almost too often. This leads into what are considered nearly automatic disaster relief triggers by the federal government, primarily by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and that's happening very often in aridifying regions. And then climate change scenarios, if we bring that out to the end of the century, they suggest amplifications in this process. So the areas that have gotten drier over the last 24 years are going to continue to get drier, and the areas that are getting wetter are going to continue not qualifying for that drought relief as often. So the first thing that we wanted to do with this project was actually compare the U.S. Drought Monitor to these two different ways of defining drought. One that defines it based on the period of record, based on a really long reference period, and the other based on 30-year climatologies. And what we see, even though neither of them match up in terms of the real extreme drought numbers that we've seen in the U.S. Drought Monitor. This is the actual data from the Drought Monitor over the last 25 years. What we do see is that the period of record really matches up much more closely with the declarations made by the U.S. Drought Monitor in terms of really focusing in on the southwestern U.S., for example, than they do with the 30-year reference period. So the U.S. Drought Monitor declares severe drought more often than either reference period, but spatial patterns of the period of record, especially in the Southwest and the Southern Rockies, align best with the USDM. And it's important to remember, and you all know this, that the U.S. Drought Monitor triggers disaster declarations and relief. So this is that fast-track, nearly automatic designation that happens based on the USDM through the USDA, the Secretary of Agriculture. And these are the percent of years where secretarial disaster declarations for drought were made in 2012 to 2021. So this is a decade's worth. And portions of the Southwest saw a secretarial disaster designation for drought nearly 100% of the time. There are actually counties here in southern Arizona that were declared, that had this official declaration of drought emergencies 100% of the time, every single year. And those, of course, trigger relief. Programs like the Livestock Forage Disaster Program are benchmarked to the secretarial disasters and to the U.S. Drought Monitor. And what we see is over that same 10-year period, 2012 to 2021, $7.6 billion went to ranchers for forage assistance when they were experiencing drought conditions of various extremities. And what we see when we standardize those numbers by agricultural receipts, as we do here, a lot of those declarations have been overweighted. A lot of that assistance has been overweighted towards the Southwest, where we've seen most of those drought declarations. We find that drought bias, this declaring drought based on outdated information, really affects declarations and relief in two ways. One, in regions that are aridifying, that are getting drier, we see a lot of disaster relief going to those regions, but that outweighs the amount of relief that's going for adaptation. And those are the areas where adaptation is needed the most. They're seeing the most extreme changes. The opposite side of that coin is that areas that are shifting wetter, like the Pacific Northwest, are under-assessed for drought and are not qualifying for drought relief, even though communities there are adapting to those wetter conditions. When it's a little bit drier and they experience a drought, they're not getting the relief that they need. So we calculated a correction. This is sort of how much relief would be given compared to how much was given if we were using this moving window approach that was updating our normals, that was saying, we know the baseline is shifting and we're going to treat this short-term relief program, this insurance program, as just that. And we would have seen less assistance going to the southwestern U.S. and more assistance going to areas that have experienced wetter climatologies. And, this has a big dollar difference to the tune of $254 million would have been spent less given this way of distributing funds. We can also run this out into the future. So under climate change, we know that many areas of the country are getting warmer. Some areas of the country are getting drier. And what we can say is how much drier, given this business as usual, using the period of record, using all of the data, including outdated data to define drought, versus using a more stationary definition of drought that rolls along 30 years. And what we see is that under the period of record definition of drought, we see an increase in the amount of drought. This is showing the percent of the contiguous U.S. that would be under those severe drought declarations per year going out into the future. And under the most extreme emission scenarios, we would see an increase from, about 10 to 12% of the country being under those severe drought declarations per year today to upwards of, perhaps 35% of the country being under those declarations when you consider precipitation and temperature together. But if we shift to a 30-year climatology, we still see some increase in the amount of drought that's being declared because places are aridifying, but it's much less so. And we see that there's a spatial pattern to that too. The areas that are experiencing the most aridification will be declared more in drought under this period of record-based drought relief than those that are under this 30-year. So period of record-based drought declarations are likely to enter a state of perpetual drought by the end of the century for much of the country. So we've got to ask the question, are programs like this meant to be risk buffering programs? Or are they meant to be subsidies? And I think the answer is risk buffering, and what we need to be doing is investing in adaptation. So our recommendations for drought monitoring is to begin this transition to standard, regularly updated reference period climatologies that are short and better represent contemporary conditions, to develop sector-specific drought assessments that align with adaptive capacity of certain systems. Agricultural system is a great example. And to gauge more fully with climate projections in order to inform drought adaptation efforts. We have recommendations for policymakers to ensure that drought relief programs are responding to contemporary risk instead of outdated risk profiles, to support drought monitoring as a tool for both risk assessment and climate adaptation, and to target adaptation funds and support in those places and sectors that are experiencing the greatest change. But what I want to share with you are these recommendations for agricultural producers. My recommendation is to educate yourselves. What are the trends in drought and other extreme events in your area? And you're doing a great job by being a part of this program. The second is to focus on climate adaptation. How do we continue to produce food given climate change? How do you keep on producing in the face of this changing environment? And then to engage in drought monitoring in your local community, in your state, and at a national level. So to ask the question, how are local drought conditions assessed in your state, and find out how you can be a part of it. So going back to our game plan, I want to share with you one resource that's come out recently that is about agricultural resilience to drought and really highlights some of the hazards that we're seeing with climate change. And that's the National Climate Assessment. The 5th National Climate Assessment was just released last fall and really contains a lot of great information for agricultural producers. In fact, there's a whole chapter that focuses on the food system here in North America and the changes that we're expecting to see into the future. One of those biggest changes that we're expecting to see are an increase in extreme events that really do affect our food system in the United States. Events like wildfires, which increase smoke on the landscape and can really make deleterious conditions for farmers. Flooding, crop failure, an increase in drought, 2 times an increase in drought, and heat waves that make it dangerous to be outside and really affect our plants. We're seeing this all across the country. It's a shift in seasons where things like spring snow melting earlier in certain parts of the country, spring snowpack declining. We've seen it here in northern Montana. Our frost-free season length increasing by 4 days per decade since 1979. This is a good thing. Some of these changes could have positive impacts on our food system. Our wildfire season is lengthening. Leaf and bloom dates are shifting, meaning that we're having to adapt our timing for planting and monitoring and assisting in some of those phenological changes. Our heat wave season is increasing across the nation, and our growing season has gotten longer in certain parts of the country as well. We see this in the plant hardiness zones. USDA just released their latest update to the plant hardiness zones, and they are shifting quite a bit. I know that here in Missoula in western Montana, we've shifted a couple zones in this last update, and we're expecting to, as we go into mid-century and late century, we're getting warmer. We're going to be moving into areas that can accommodate less hardy plants. One of the biggest impacts that we have on our agricultural community, and we've really seen it in an intense way over the last couple of years, is wildfire smoke. You all know that being outside in some of these really smoky days is bad for our health. We feel it. And it's something to keep in mind as maybe not an impact that's super local, but is one that's affecting everybody across the country. This is a great resource for keeping track of fire activity and smoke across the country, airnow.gov. We've seen snowpack changes in the west that are really impacting our water availability. We're seeing it in western Montana this summer, and this is a long-term trend. Our snowpack across the west has decreased quite substantially since 1955. So over the last 70 years. And what we're seeing is not only just a net decrease in April 1st snowpack, one of those benchmark dates that we often use when defining snowpack, but we're also seeing that the timing of the peak snowpack is shifting, sometimes differently in different parts of the country, and the length of our snowpack season is also shifting. We're seeing shifts in rangeland productivity, where some of the warmer conditions may be helping, or at least were helping for a while, but now we've been seeing over the last decade or 2 decades a long-term decrease in net primary productivity across the western U.S. in our rangeland productivity. And one of the things that it's really important to keep in mind is that we see compounding effects of all of these different changes on our food system. So, we've got temperature and rainfall impacting our production systems, right? A lack of temperature or a lack of rainfall, too much heat, too much rain, every way that you have it, it can have an impact on our production. But then we've got hurricanes and floods that impact our storage, processing, and distribution at a global scale, droughts and wildfires that can really affect our retail markets, and then changing El Nino patterns and changing seasonality that can also impact consumption of food. So it's happening at all levels of our food system, and it takes a systems thinker to start adapting to some of those challenges. challenges. We see some examples of those compound events in 2020 and 2021. Remember, this was the COVID pandemic, but it was also a period where we saw severe drought across much of the West that started huge fires, that had big impacts on offshore winds in Oregon and Washington that affected agriculture. We saw impacts on shellfish. We saw then in 2021 these huge atmospheric rivers that also caused damage and mudslides across the West, including in Montana. So we saw really an example of these compound events as we moved from August of 2020 through 2021. So one place to go to start educating yourself about some of these impacts, both in the near term and as we move on through the century, is the 5th National Climate Assessment Atlas. This is a tool that allows you to explore all of the data from the 5th National Climate Assessment and zoom in on your local area to find out what the impacts are going to be near you. You can explore climate trends and impacts. There's a story map, a nice visual way of exploring those climate impacts. And then if you're geeky like me, you can download data from the 5th National Climate Assessment. And that's available at atlas.globalchange.gov. So with that, thank you so much. I think questions might be able to get to me, but really congratulations for signing up for such a unique program. And I hope that my presentation has been helpful.